Hello everybody and welcome to today's webinar on how to make podcasting pay, or at least cover some of the costs. I'm Linda Coburn, I'm the moderator for this session, so I'll talk you through what's going to happen and then through the process of the webinar. The first thing to say is I've just had one of those messages to say that my internet connection is unstable, so please, if it becomes uncomfortable, will somebody let me know and then I'll turn my video off. So other than that, the webinar is brought to you by The Space. And I guess that some people know about The Space and the work that we do, but if not, here's a quick overview of what we're about. Really the UK's digital commissioning and development agency. And as you can see from this, that in essence, what we do is commission and work with and support the sector in building digital skills, and have done over a long period of time, worked with lots of different organisations. And it's that knowledge that we hope to share with you here. Somebody will put a link into chat, but actually one of our strategic mentoring programs is still open for applications at the moment. So if you're interested in that, we'll put the details into the chat. So that's who we are. And I'll just give you an overview of what we're going to do today, what the schedule looks like. So we'll have start with a discussion from our panelists, really get them to introduce themselves and tell you a bit about the kind of work that they do and why they're here, in essence. And then Claire Freeman is going to give a presentation really thinking about how you make podcasting pay in some really practical ways, then a bit of time for Q&A with Claire. And then we'll be bringing in our other speaker, Markstedman, who's speaking about the costs of podcasting other than money. And so thinking about time, your resources and so on. And then we've got some time at the end for some more general questions and sort of picking up on some of the themes and ideas that you've spoken about during the session. So that is the plan overall. And in order to sort of make that all go smoothly, there's a few more things to tell you. One is that we're recording the session, so it will be available for a period of 6 months. I think it goes up a couple of weeks after this, and it's on our YouTube channel. We have Claire, our live captioner, with us today. So if live captions would be helpful to you, you need to go to the bottom of the screen and select the option that works for you. And also Claire, who's doing sort of presentation, she hasn't got PowerPoint slides, but she is going to, she's put together a kind of a useful document. And if you would like a copy of that, you need to email events@space.org and we'll send you a copy after the session. And lastly, we use chat, as you may know, a lot for both putting questions to the speakers and also for the audience to discuss and exchange ideas. And sometimes there's a whole other conversation going on as well, which is great. It's just a really useful space to share. And because a lot of people on the webinar, we don't have cameras or microphones on, but just be thinking, if you're chatting in chat, it is an open space, it's an open forum for everyone. So just make sure that whatever you do and say feels inclusive and that you're not leaving anybody out, that it's got a good tone to it. Okay. I think that is everything I need to say at the beginning. I really hope you enjoy it. I'm looking forward to today. I think we've got great speakers, really interesting content, and sort of thinking about, you know, not just about how do you make a podcast. That's really not what we're interested in. We're thinking, okay, what are some of the practical aspects that will make it sustainable over time? Okay, so I'm going to bring in our speakers now. So Rob and Claire and Mark, if you wouldn't mind putting your cameras on. Hello. Cameras on and unmute yourselves, and then we'll get to it. So I'm going to start with Rob. So I'm going to just ask the speakers to introduce themselves, and then we'll delve a little bit deeper into their work. So Rob, just tell us who you are and a little bit about your job.
Thanks, Linda. Hi, everybody. My name's Rob Lindsay. I'm head of programs at The Space. As Linda said before, we're a support agency helping the arts, creative, heritage communities connect their work with audiences using digital means. That might be digital work, It might be digital first work, it might be digital extensions, it could be all sorts of things, whatever your definition of digital is, and whatever your definitions of arts and audiences are as well. My role is to oversee a number of programs of support that the space offers. That might be through our mentoring program that we run. It might also be through some of our low-cost R&D programs as well, where we offer pilot support for people to take next steps with digital projects involving funding and guidance too. All manner of different things. And I know I've seen a number of familiar faces on the list of attendees, and I'm sure a number of you will have seen me speak at these webinars as well. But that's me. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rob. And Claire, do you want to introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your work?
Yeah, so I am a podcast producer. Mostly, I kind of work with audio. Audio is my medium. I used to work in radio and a bit of TV at the BBC for 10 years. And about 4 years ago, or is it 5? It was all just kind of like blurred, really. I stepped away from that and decided to go freelance and really explore what podcasting was about. And obviously with lockdown, the term podcast has kind of become a bit, common day term, it's even in the dictionary, those kind of things. People know what it is. So the work that I've done has kind of changed a little bit. I consult people, I help people who've already started podcasts take it to the next level. I help as an associate with the space, part of the mentoring program, something which I know we'll mention on this webinar. There is a mentoring program open at the moment. And help people, with those ideas, how to get that strategy and make it really have impact. And then I also podcast myself. I have my own podcast series where I've turned them from a podcast to a TV show, an idea of a conversation with me and a friend in a kitchen, to podcasts that, are now in the top 20 health and fitness charts. So I've played a lot, I've experimented a lot, I learn a lot, but I'm really excited about this particular webinar because I'm really interested to know what Mark's been up to. And also I'm keen to kind of have this be quite interactive, that if you are already learning and trialing some of these things, I want you to be busy in the chat. I want you to tell me about your podcast. I want you to tell me about some of the things that you're learning, because I've got my notepad and pen here. I want to learn from you too. So anyway, there you go.
Thanks, Claire. Thank you. And so nice opportunity to bring Mark in. Do you want to just set the scene, Mark? Tell us a bit about you and your work.
Thank you. Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name's Markstedman. I run a podcasting school for social entrepreneurs called Podcode. I used to be involved in podcast tech, and I managed to escape that life and now work with what I think of as a lot more of the squishy stuff in between the waveforms. So covering the technical and the production stuff, but also, as we'll get into, what are some of the other things that we need to consider? How do we look after ourselves? How do we engage with audiences? How do we think about the people that we want to serve as part of our podcasting? And so, yeah, like Claire said, I'm really excited to hear what people are working on, and saw a bit of buzz yesterday from some people that I know on Twitter. So it's lovely to get another chance to connect to people. As lockdowns are, we're maybe contemplating moving around. I'm excited to be among people again and to get to explore and have more conversations. So it's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me along. And yeah.
Okay, so just to kind of carry on, so some of the work you do, you're saying you work with social entrepreneurs and you do kind of podcast coaching, I think is be your term for it. Can you give us a flavour of the sorts of questions you get asked as a podcast coach, Mark? Just a bit of a hint to sort of set up what we're going to say later.
Absolutely. They can range. And I think when I used to work more in the technology space, where it was more broad in terms of the podcasters that I worked with, the questions would be around the kind of things that we're going to address today, like how do I make money from this? Whereas what I now tend to help people with is a podcast that is furthering a particular mission or something that, whether it's a business or something that they care about. And so there's sort of less, it becomes less about that and more perhaps about how we can support the podcaster. And so the questions now, obviously there's the kind of tech things about what should I buy, what gear should I use, and that kind of thing. But they really range. And actually what I try and do is help people consider questions that they might not have considered about who their audience is and how their audience benefits as a result of listening to their show.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And Rob, back to you. What are the kinds of questions that you're dealing with in this space?
Yeah, very, very similar things. A lot of it about sustainability. You know, I think that there are a lot of people who moved into podcasting as a result of lockdown and of COVID. You know, a lot of the people that we work with and we speak to are within the arts sector. So anyone that used to stand on a stage and talk to people started looking to podcasting as the kind of alternative version of doing that. You know, any kind of playwrights, any poets, any kind of spoken word performers of any kind really were looking to move into that space. Obviously everyone was trying to do those things. Everyone sort of suddenly had digital thrust upon them all at the same time, so there was an element of everyone sort of taking that jump at the same time, and it was a difficult time for a lot of people. I think now we're in a period where people are saying, okay, as we emerge out of this, exactly as Mark says, as we can now go and see people again and have those conversations, step onto those stages again. It's people starting to say, okay, so what is podcasting as we move forward? How can we make this more strategic, more sustainable? What's it going to be as we move forward?
Thank you. Thanks very much. And Claire, obviously you've been researching and really looking at the ways in which people are making podcasts pay. What was it that started you off down this route, this area of interest?
I think the conversation that you mentioned before has moved on. You know, originally people were saying, you know, what is a podcast? How do I start one? And now I think people are cottoning on to the fact that making a podcast is quite a lot of a commitment. Like, it takes up quite a lot of time and energy. It's much more than, you know, hit and record and then publishing something. There's a lot more. That probably only really accounts for like a fifth of it. You know, it's all the other stuff that kind of goes on. And so people were like, I like the idea of this, but I need to make this sustainable. And particularly now, you know, the conversation we were having in lockdown, as Rob mentioned, people were like, I need to find another kind of strand so I can keep sharing my work and, you know, be a bit more sustainable rather than just rely on touring and physical exhibitions. And now I think people are like kind of having to juggle both of these. They need to make this digital avenue or podcasting kind of really be effective. And I think that the scene has changed. You know, I spent a good few days just really listening, reading, seeing what has changed, because in lockdown meant that the number of podcasts out there is astronomically more than there were before. So making it cut, you know, through the noise is important. But there are more examples. You know, I've always loved podcasting as a place where there really are no formula. You know, the more niche, the better. And people are very kind of inventive and very creative about how they make this work. And the number of examples that are out there now to kind of quash that little voice that we all have inside us that says, oh, but how are you going to pay the rent? How are you going to do this? You've still got to do a proper job. And actually seeing other people, it got me excited about this space, doing research for this project, because it is incredible what people are doing. And that's what I want to kind of show people. When you see how many links and how many podcast series there are out there making this happen, it's inspirational.
Brilliant. Okay, lovely. So in a second, I'm just going to hand over to you and you can carry on and really get into the meat of your presentation. And I'm going to say to Rob and Mark, thank you. You can turn your cameras off. And if you wouldn't mind just having a look at some of the commentary that's happened in the chat already. And if you've got anything to add to it or want to carry on those conversations, that would be brilliant. But in the meantime, over to Claire. So away you go.
Okay, right. That's a nice way of saying don't bollocks it up, Claire. Right, I'm going to attempt to share. Everybody knows how successful that can be sometimes. Okay, I'm sharing a screen now, okay, and it's like massive scale writing, but I think that might make it a little bit easier for everyone to read. This is going to be a handout, which we've said before is available. So if you just want to listen, absorb, You don't have to write down, oh, what did she say? What was that link again? You can ask in chat if you want something specifically. Risha's got a copy of this and she's got the links if you need it. But I wanted to just kind of have something that is almost a bit of a fly through, which if you want to go and listen and check out these things at a later date, you can, okay? We've got like about 20 minutes to kind of fly through this, which isn't really that long. So some of the questions we were thinking about as part of this, what can you do to give yourself the best chance of creating something sustainable? What kind of business models are out there? What can we learn from others? And then, as well as money, some of the costs or resources, how do you create kind of a manageable model? So this is applicable for people who are new to podcasting, who are already podcasting. It's always good when you are doing a podcast to kind of think, right, am I doing everything I need to? Because this field is changing constantly. So I've put in this handout, we've already explained who I am, who is the space, shameless plug, I'm just going to kind of put that here, follow the Space Arts podcast. If you are, particularly an arts and cultural organisation, looking to hear from people who've already received funding as part of the commissioning process in the space, and talk about kind of stepping into this digital world, there are 6 episodes right now that you can listen to of fantastic organisations. So we kind of ended up in my kind of mad researching flurry, pinning this down to like 5 sections, I thought, 5 things to consider. Number 1 is, do you have a clear vision and strategy for your podcast? Mark mentioned a bit about number 2. Are you audience focused? Number 3, get tech savvy. Number 4 is about the options of paid podcasting. We'll spend most of the time talking about this really. And number 5 is the cons. Here is the bit, what no one tells you about making money podcasting, as someone who has been in those shoes as a passion podcaster and now with someone that makes a living. So yeah, that's what we'll get into. So number 1, do you have a clear vision and strategy? What do I mean by this? These are kind of coming back to the basics really about podcasting, knowing your why. Why on earth are you doing this? And don't just do because you think you should, because everyone else is podcasting. You need to be really clear about what it is that you really kind of want to aim and why you're doing it. Just have a little think about that, pause, stop. Partnerships are incredibly important. Again, something that we talk about in the Space Arts podcast. But partnerships are like the minesweeper, I think, when you do podcasting. It helps if you are starting a podcast with 0 audience, 0 following. It allows you to kind of make that big jump to get into a wider market. I put here an example about Dante or Die are a theatre company. They came through the space commissioning rounds. I worked with them as a mentor for their pop-up theatre show, User Not Found. And it was due to go on tour in Canada, but of course, dreaded lockdown happened and that was taken away from them. Instead, they turned it into a video podcast. And they partnered with The Guardian so that The Guardian had an exclusive kind of deal with Dante or Die to promote that content for the first 30 days, and then it could be shared across other platforms. They had a write-up in the paper, they had a section on The Guardian website, and that got them to a bigger audience straight away. Also, Audio Moves is Petra Theatre, Dante or Die's sister, and they've also just done a partnership of a series to help children move, and they partnered with Fun Kids Radio, which is the UK's #1 children's radio station, and they shared their content on their weekly schedule to help, again, reach a wider audience. So the other things is thinking about a launch peg. Timing helps. Are you pinning this to an anniversary 3 years ago today? If it was a women's football podcast, would you look at tying it to the UEFA Women's Cup, which is coming up in July? Thinking about getting that momentum, tying yourself to an event rather than just putting it out willy-nilly without a hook, as just something lovely. It's not enough. Managing your time, we're going to talk a lot about this in this webinar. Is this series better released as a kind of episodic series or a box set? you know, being realistic about the time this is going to take you to do, and setting a realistic budget. You know, I mean, I smile at this because it's hard when you've never made a podcast before, knowing what is going on. And even if you are making a podcast series, maybe you've done a pilot, I think it's really been true to reflect on how much time this really takes, not just about the cost of your equipment. So that's kind of back to the basics. The audience focused questions. So number 2, are you audience focused? So I kind of put here, just take a pause about this. You do not want to be a generalist. You don't want to aim to have everybody in the world listen. Don't aim for 1 million listeners straight off the bat. You know, who are the people you want to reach? I like to draw characters. I've kind of heard about someone do like a canvas, a podcast canvas. You know, what are the hashtags? What papers do these people read? You know, what do they do? Where do they socialize? Get to know them. Because then when you come to have the marketing plan, and I've put a link here to 100 marketing ideas for your podcast, this is where you can really focus the content of your series, even where you choose to market, and, you know, which channels you get to use in terms of socials. It all kind of comes back to this kind of character, this persona of this person that you're really aiming at. Helps you kind of think as a content maker to almost kind of be talking directly to that person. Give them a name. Bobby, Betty. I don't know why, but all mine begin with B. Barbara is another one that I have as well. So socials, don't spread yourself too thin. Pick one where your audience is. I do a weight loss podcast. I find that more people who are into weight loss are on Instagram. I find that more people, when I talk about ice hockey, are on Twitter. So choose your social. Don't try and do everything to everyone. I've also put a link here to some brilliant blogs about having a clever call to action. So what is it you want the audience to do as a result of listening to this podcast? Think about that. Don't throw it away. Do you want to drive more traffic to your website? Do you want them to sign up to a newsletter? Do you want them to come and see a tour that you're about to kind of go live with in the theatre? Think about what it is you want them to do. And I've put a brilliant link here to a great resource, which you should just all go to the Space Arts website and look on resources. Sometimes, you know, when I've got a spare moment, a lot of it is blogs and things like that, written by people like me who are specialists in their field, sharing, you know, tips about what it is that you might need to think about. This audience toolkit, if you are new to kind of the digital world, treating your audience digitally is very different, I think, to the ones that you might see in person. So get tech savvy. It's quite hard to say that, actually, isn't it? Get tech savvy. I will not be saying that, you know, very quickly. Shop around for the best host. I mean, I'm assuming that most of you know what a podcast platform host is. It's the bit where you upload your MP3 file and it gets you out to Google, Spotify, Apple, all the other different kind of podcast apps that people listen on. Some of the hosts are free. So, you know, we'll talk about, say, like Anchor is free, but there might be other ones where you pay and you get a little bit more detailed analytics. And I'll explain why analytics are key in a second. The idea is that you really need to make sure that you're distributing on as many pod apps as possible, and good hosts will help you do that. You know, I've put a basics here about Apple Podcasts and Spotify are vital. In my opinion, if you have got a podcast which is not available on Apple or Spotify, it's not really a podcast. You're not getting to where podcast listeners are. A little note here about YouTube. YouTube is growing. So if you are looking at reaching a wider audience and you have a little bit of time to play and experiment, it will be separate from your podcast host, but YouTube could be a great place to kind of play and explore at the moment. There are ways to kind of look deeper into your analytics. So we've got Spotify Podcasters Dashboard, Apple Podcast Connect. You'll need your RSS feed, but these are the places where you can see how long are people listening for. Are they listening to 100% of the episode? Are they kind of dropping out about 50% of the way through? How many followers have you got? You know, you get to see like the loyalty of your listeners. And these two platforms really are the kind of key ones where most podcasters are. So the reason I think analytics are key is there's this thing called a media kit. If you want to go down the advertising route, you will need a media kit. It is basically a 2-page sum up of who you are, what you do, what the aim of the podcast is, and some deeper dive in some of the demographics behind what your series is doing. Of course, you can't really do this necessarily if you haven't got a podcast, but if you have got a podcast and you're looking at then taking it to the next level to potentially get sponsorship, a media kit is vital. Using mailing lists, you know, kind of capturing, getting your audience involved. I mean, I've put some pretty obvious tips here about maximizing your content, repurposing, taking clips out, these audiograms, are little videos which you can play on your social media with some captions of about 60-second teasers. I've put about SEO here. If you're not into, you're not up to speed with this, using your website effectively. If you embed your episodes, maybe have some of the audiogram videos, can increase your SEO. So ultimately your website is going to get bigger impact when people Google and search for that type of content that you provide. And search terms, using the words that you use in titles and descriptions are really key. I've heard of people who have increased their listeners by 1/3 just because they went through and rewrote their titles and their descriptions. Descriptions, a little tip, the first 5 words matter. Think about the first 5 words. Do not throw it away saying, on this episode, we talk about. Forget it. It's complete throwaway. And some tips here about how to get featured by podcast apps and get promoted by Apple Podcasts. It's an absolute ball ache, I'm not going to lie. But if you've got the time and you've got the energy and you want to look down that route, there are the links and good blog posts that can kind of help you think about that. Right, let's get to the meat, because this is, I think, why most of you have kind of want to come. I want to spend most time here. Paid podcasting, what your options are. So obviously you can go and get adverts, which you would then play in your episode. You can go and approach people direct. There are also some of the platforms which will help connect you to people who are kind of already wanting to kind of sponsor podcasts. Spotify and Anchor are a big player in this, and you get to record the script of your own adverts yourself. Acast Marketplace is another one. The thing about this is you've got to watch. I'm just going to kind of jump to this notes section here. Ideally, you need to be established with at least 8,000 listeners a month to really make this option pay. But niche audiences can work with the right sponsor. I put some links here to a couple of podcasts that are kind of playing in this field. The VO Social with Leah and Nick. These guys are not getting millions of listeners. They're incredibly niche, just aimed at people who are voiceovers. But they are unique in the market that there really isn't much competition, certainly in the UK field. And they've been able to go and get sponsorship from some of the major VO festivals, from some of the, the product providers for VOs, connecting with studios, with some of the biggest VO names. And they've really just honed their niche, and they put together a media kit, and boom, within a year, they started making money from sponsorship. Not big bucks, but it was enough to show that, in terms of the little guys, it's possible. The Fertility Podcast, Natalie Silverman, who does this, is fantastic at really thinking about this idea of assets, whether you've got your website, your socials, your podcast, getting some kind of sponsorship deal that might appear as a specialist episode in your series, but then separately, they may have to pay extra to advertise on your social feed. Real kind of commercial outlook about how to use your content effectively. So have a look at that. I would say with this, try and think long-term, don't get sponsorship per episode. Because you're not going to make much. It takes a lot of work to do this. I would ideally not really go down this route if possible, unless you're playing big number listeners a month. Couple of links here as well. Adam Buxton, just listen to the adverts that he makes, just pure delight listening. And a blog here about how a passion-led football podcast now makes $500 plus a month. So there is this field here, which I'm not going to spend too long on because it's very new and it's mostly in America, but it's one to watch. So something called Apple subscriptions, Spotify subscriptions, Acast Plus, Supercast. These are all platforms where you go to Apple Podcasts, and for a fee of, say, $2.49 to $4.99 per month, a listener can have access to, say, Wondery, which do lots of fiction-based podcasts. They can have early access, so they listen to the series first. They're free of adverts. Yeah, and and I don't know what the take-up of this is. It's incredibly new. Spotify subscriptions at the moment are only American. There isn't really the detail about what fees they are for producers. It could be 5% from Spotify in 2023. One to watch, it's not a big one in the UK market. So let's see where that goes. We're normally lagging by about 2 years in the UK podcast market compared to North America. This is the fun one, okay? Pay to support, okay? We've heard, many of us, about Buy Me a Coffee, Patreon, Twitch, Crowdfunder, Indiegogo. Probably many of you have used this to kind of maybe take tours or ideas before. But in podcast world, this is where most podcasters are having the most fun, but also getting the most impact. I just want to pick out Ian here, who is part of our Mick podcast meetup club. And Ian is fantastic because he has a passion for talking about the history of the Cold War. And it literally was just him talking about conversations of people who share this connection, history, passion. And he shares his podcast on YouTube as well as major podcast platforms. But he started a Patreon because he wanted to kind of see where this could take him in terms of support. He has different packages, including the chance for people to potentially, have a one-to-one meetup with him or suggest a future topic for him to get into. And actually, as someone who started as a passion project, he's making over £1,500 a month now, which is incredible. So this guy, I think, is amazing to kind of show what it can be. We've got some of the bigger guys here that I've put about. Ian Lee, the broadcaster, who went a little bit off mainstream with some addiction problems that were in the press, but he's making a mint in his own field. Patreon, you can pay £299 per month for Patreon to go and have a Zoom. You can have like your tea over Zoom with him. Like you can, if they're doing a live event, you get your personal live stream to the event if you can't be there in person. When you actually go and look at some of these links later and see what they're offering, I mean, some of it is just crazy. It's just really playful and fun. The Flame, a musical podcast, musical, I only discovered this a couple of days ago. They have got a fiction-based podcast. This is the one they've already done. And it was, it's quite a listen, to be honest, but listeners even have the chance, if they back the project, to potentially suggest script lines, to be characters in the show. The listener interaction is absolutely incredible. They're doing their next project, which is a choose your own adventure podcast musical, and they're looking to raise £42,000. So this is big, but they're asking their listeners to do that rather than go down the traditional funding route. So some ideas here. I mean, there's the obvious thing. Most include bonus content, early access, but this idea of kind of really personalizing and putting a value on your time, really, that you want to connect with the listeners, either one-on-one or a group Zoom, is really playful and fun. And it can be whatever you think that you want it to be, from £1 to £299 per month. So I've got one here about create your own app, the Anfield Wrap. Liverpool Football Club fans obviously having a great time at the moment. But these guys were once a fan-based podcast, and they really saw how to commercial this. They've been going for a number of years, and they now have their own app. You pay, I think it's between £7 and £10 a month. And you have 100 audio and video shows per month, plus access to the full back catalogue. And that has enabled them to kind of develop a full team. They've got, they did have a city centre based office, and we're talking like 5K per month plus of subscriptions. I mean, this is incredible. It's super niche, but they saw a need in the market that perhaps Liverpool Football Club themselves weren't really fulfilling. And again, that is amazing because there are so many football podcasts, but how did these guys kind of make it have such impact? and they, you know, kind of creating this exclusive content, putting it behind a paywall and being bold enough to say, we're doing this, but we need you to pay so we can continue. And as Brits, sometimes we can be a bit guilty of asking for people to pay. And these guys are proving that actually people are willing to pay if your content is good enough. Thinking about a back catalogue as well, Answer Me This podcast, one of the very, very first podcasts ever out there to be. It's now finished, but they sold off their back catalogue as themed albums for £3, and people bought it. So I've added a couple of other things here about events. Think about live Q&A audience recordings. Could you monetize Meet the Presenters, photo opportunities, merch here? If they love you, then merch up your slogans. You know, you could even put that in your Patreon offer. The VO Social have got their own water bottle and a career planner. Do you know what I mean? A little side here, one that is very kind of controversial and new, but watch this space for: NFTs for podcasters. I've put a link to a blog here by thepodcasthost.com, and they talk about this kind of murky world. I'm not going to get into what NFTs are here because I'll kind of launch a bomb, I think. But watch this space for, you know, artists creating and kind of finding value in their work in terms of the digital content. So just to round off, I added number 5 in as the cons, what no one tells you about making money podcasting. So I put here, watch out for editorial control with your sponsors. Will they want to kind of edit your content, listen to it before you go out? Be careful about that. Read the small print, particularly if you're going in any exclusive deals, if you're going down the advertising route. Do you still own your own IP, or are you giving that away to them? So if you tie your, you know, if you cut ties with them, is it still your content that you can keep out there and repurpose and reuse? My advice would be to not start charging listeners before you build your audience. Think of the audience first and then see how you can kind of take it to the next level. I put here about most podcast subscription models are based on a US audience, not UK. You know, like I say, American audience are used to adverts. They don't mind that there's always adverts at the start of podcasts, but not always in the UK. We're used to the kind of BBC model and things being free and able to access them very easily. And I put here about you could feel like you're slightly selling your soul and what was a passion project. I can already see that a few of you are doing kind of podcasts kind of on the side for passion. And as someone who kind of went from talking quite openly and vulnerably and authentically about my weight loss journey with a friend in my kitchen, to then turning that into an exclusive, you know, sponsored deal with a major weight loss organization, I found that very difficult because I felt like I put pressure on me that I needed, because the ante was upped, I needed to kind of raise my game and the vibe. And it took me a long time to find my groove about making that switch from passion to like actually getting paid for that. So just bear in mind with that. And this is going to tie into what Mark's going to talk about. It's not always the physical things that cost the most when podcasting. It is your time. And I'm going to say to you, how much is your time worth? How do you put a value on your time? So anyway, that's some kind of thoughts I put here. Remember why you want a podcast in the first place. Think about what you're calling success. It needs to be more than money. It needs to be more than just the number of listeners that you're aiming for. Keep it fun, stay passionate, stay authentic and curious. And be connected. You know, there are brilliant online podcast communities. I'm a part of one called Mix Podcast Club. We meet on Zoom once a month. We have speakers who kind of talk about new things. We connect, we share ideas with us. And that's what's really, really key about the podcast world, is keeping it fresh, not assuming you know it all, and just having fun. So I hope that's kind of planted a few seeds. I'll go linger in chat, and I think I'll hand back over to Linda, because I think we're just going to take a break, or are we doing a few questions? What are we doing?
We'll do some questions. Well, up to you. Have you got capacity for questions now? Or would you like a break and then questions? Because you've been talking for, you know, you've done a long chunk.
No, I'm totally fine. I can, yeah.
So we've got 10 minutes then for questions to you. And I'm just thinking, we've had lots of comments in the chat, people saying, wow, there's so much information in here. So just if there's anything, particular questions that you want to ask Claire, now is a good time to do it. And before we we've got one specific one, and there's thank yous coming in, Claire. But before we get into that, Claire, you've done a lot of kind of investigating, looking around. Is there anything particularly interested you in what you found out?
I think looking at what people are putting on ideas behind Patreon was really interesting, because they're just quite bold and they're quite playful. And I think I have learned, I've got some podcasts where I'll only have 80 listeners per episode. And I've got others that are 23,000 per episode. But even with the 80 listeners per episode, these people are really invested. They come back. I actually know most of them by name. It's that kind of intimacy and being bold enough to say, we want to keep doing this podcast, but we need your support. Here's what we can give to you if you choose to invest in us. Sometimes I think it can feel uncomfortable, but I thought it was quite fun, what people were suggesting. I mean, the idea of potentially having tea with your favorite podcaster over Zoom, it just made me laugh.
It's really interesting you said that, because at the same time we've got another question which says, which might be sort of carrying on really from what you're talking about. She's saying, do you have any tips for people looking for partnerships and monetization when they don't have a big audience? And it's come in as well in previously, people saying, well, how do we justify the cost to potential partners, or in brackets funders?
Yeah.
So are there any other things that you can do when you're sort of dealing with a small audience base?
Yeah, and we have to say, right, that it's very, very few podcasters. I think it's something like 5% of podcasters are actually making money, as in more than covering the cost. 5%. So you're in the 95%. Do not worry. The average number of listens per podcast. This is a figure that I read 3 years ago, was 124 listens per episode. And I think now with lockdown, maybe that's gone down because there's so much more competition. I think it depends on what your subject is. The more niche, if you are creating some content that is fulfilling a need which is not currently being served. So, the idea so if we look at art galleries or museums, it's adding context behind the pieces. Often people don't have time to kind of look and read the little tiny what little white sticker with black writing, but they'd like to know more about it. And actually an idea of kind of reaching audiences that aren't coming to your museum or art gallery, how can you reach them in the digital world? Then it might hook the curiosity to make them come back through the doors. These are kind of they're kind of more functional, purpose-driven podcasts. And if you can kind of go for those more tangible kind of aims with your podcast, then that's what's going to help. And the funders are going to say, I see what you're doing. This is a good platform for you to kind of play and try. Here's the money for a pilot series. Do you know what I mean? I think it's focusing on that niche and that demand. And they don't always have to be beautiful storytelling, Radio 4 podcasts. They can sometimes be quite functional, for context. They can just be, here's a place, or repurposing, getting the cassette tapes of archives off your shelves and turning it into something else. I mean, we did that with Cornwall Museum's partnership over lockdown, where we turned them into a Alexa smart speaker, choose your own adventure story. So it's looking for that niche, and that's where you're going to win the attention of funders.
I'm presuming that's really just about knowing your audience, knowing what you do well, what makes you special and distinct, which is really key, isn't it? So kind of the effort really to think about those things and I guess work out what works for your audience. Okay, so we're saying functional, tangible, purposeful, some giving people a reason. And we had another specific question. Is there a particular platform that you'd recommend for monetization, aside from what you've spoken about? No one you'd go for?
Not really. I haven't really gone down this route. I mean, the easy ones are things like Anchor, which are owned by Spotify now, and they actually come up with suggestions, and you record the ads there and then, and it adds it into your episode. I don't know. It's something that you have to look at for your own podcast, really. I can't really pin what that is.
Thank you. And that's fair enough, isn't it? There's not a specific answer that would work for everybody. That's
I don't think there's a right or wrong in any of this. That is, you know, we might hear different ideas or different perspective from Mark a little bit later on. And that's the point, that I think you just have to play and be open-minded. That's almost the fun of podcasting, that it's not a black and white situation. There aren't really no rules here, that you just got to try. And part of, I think, what more funders are open up to now, whether it be the Space or the Arts Council, they're being a bit more open to kind of say, yeah, we see what you're aiming at there. Here's a pot of money to maybe go and try that. And that's quite freeing. They're getting the monetization, I suppose, is just, yeah, you just got to play and see what happens. And if it doesn't work, then stop, try something else.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to read you another question, which says, great tip on optimizing the first 5 words in the description. The person then says, I'll do that right away. Any other easy tweaks that can make a big difference to audience numbers, please?
I mean, I'm currently doing some research at the moment about how to kind of reach new audiences. And I think one of the wins that I had a number of years ago was, you know, with radio programs, people kind of like choose their radio station and they stay to that radio station. They're quite loyal. They don't often bounce around radio stations. But with podcasts, it's a bit different. So we're not really competitors to each other. You might have your niche. Say like my niche was ice hockey. And I knew that I was listening to multiple ice hockey podcasts. So I would collaborate with other ice hockey podcasts to kind of do a show, which then we put out on both of our feeds, which then introduced their listeners to me and my listeners to them. And we kind of, I've heard about promo swaps. So are there other podcasts that are kind of in your field that maybe you could kind of connect with or hook up with, you know, either via something like a podcast club, or just get to know them and say, hey, we're kind of doing podcasts in the same field. Is there any way we could kind of collaborate and cross promote to our audiences? It might just kind of help, you know, rather than thinking of it us versus them. So they're not like that in the podcast world.
Okay. I'm just checking that that's the last question I think that we've had. Have you explored paid newsletters which feature audio, such as Substack?
I haven't, Joe. But maybe, I mean, I'll see whether Mark replies on the chat to that one. I would just say partnerships. We didn't mention that, just quickly. Partnerships are interesting because if you are trying to reach a new audience, say like a lot of, I don't know, galleries and museums are trying to reach a younger audience. That's like kind of something that it comes up again and again on application forms. Then think about how do you get the content to those people. Your partnerships could enable that. You know, in other ones, we're trying to reach an older audience. Now, they are not so tech savvy. They don't know what a podcast is or how to play it. You have to explain it to them. But if I can get that content through the doors of, say, a library, you know, somewhere where I know older people go and they've got the kind of equipment digitally and the internet to kind of enable that, how can I form a partnership with those people to get my content to the audience that I'm aiming at? It's kind of thinking about that aspect of it. This is what I mean about audience focused. And that's where partnerships can help, not only just promote to a wider number of people, but get to the target audience that you're ultimately trying to aim at. Okay, lovely.
All right. We've had another question about audience building, but I'm going to leave that till the end so that we get input from everybody. So thank you very much. Mark's commenting, saying, oh yeah, he's got a take on paid newsletters. Lovely. Claire, thank you so much. That's fab. We're going to take a 5-minute break, a screen break now. So we'll come back at 11:55 and bring Mark in, sort of hear from him, and then bring all our panelists back in for a final kind of Q&A after that. So look forward to seeing you in 5 minutes. Thanks. Okay, so welcome back, everyone. Hope you enjoyed a little break. I'm going to ask Mark to join me now, Markstedman, for the second part of our session. Hello, Mark.
Hello.
So just before we get into the kind of specifics of what you're going to cover, I wondered if there was anything you wanted to add. You've obviously been very active in chat and answering questions and so on. Anything else that you'd want to add or build on from what Claire said?
Yeah, very quickly. I mean, just so much of it was I was sort of sat here just vociferously agreeing. And something to add that I really like from the perspective of the kind of organizations that I think we have watching the video is there is a technology that is called dynamic ad insertion or dynamic content insertion. And that started its life as a way of being able to stitch ads from a marketplace into your podcast. So you could say, at this point, I'm going to have an ad. I don't know what it's going to be yet, but I know that at the 30-minute mark, there's going to be an ad. The hosting platform Captivate has made this relatively easy now for organizations to insert their own content. So where I think this gets really cool is if you, let's say you're a theater and you've produced a piece of drama, you could have a space at the beginning, somewhere near the beginning of your episode or elsewhere that says, here's the dates for our next tour, or here's the dates for our next show. If you're an artist and you're going to be exhibiting and you have a podcast where you're interviewing other artists, you can have a moment to say, I'm going to be at this place, this time, exhibiting my art. There are so many possibilities that I think it then helps your evergreen content become even more useful to you. So that's just one thing that I find really, really interesting to explore.
Brilliant, thank you. And Rob's just put a link here, to Captivate FM into the chat, so that's there. Claire said it'd be, Claire said there's no one way of doing this, nope. And she was interested to hear what you said and whether you had different points of view. Was there anything that Claire said that you'd have a different? I mean, you're saying you agreed with a lot of it. Was there anything that made you think, oh no, I wouldn't do that, or I'm not sure about that, or I've got a completely different angle here?
No, not at all. I think there are possibly perspectives or things I can add, like, talking about the dynamic stuff, but it's not because it was missed, it's, I mean, there were only 20 minutes. So yeah, there was nothing there that I thought I'd push back on, from my perspective. I think, as someone who deals much more with people who works with people who are less thinking about monetization, but absolutely about audience building and that kind of stuff, there are lots of difficult questions there. I think one of them that was in the chat was, how do you build an audience from scratch? And that may be something that we can get to towards the end of the thing, because I think I'm sure there's some ideas that between the lot of us we can kick around, because so much of what is the concern for so many of us is actually the audience building. It's once you have the audience, the options there are numerous, but the difficulty is actually building that audience. And so I think that could be something worth exploring. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, I think we'll get to that when we get everybody back. So let's just sort of get into some of the things that you're talking here, as well as everything else, but the specifics of getting you to speak about your sort of take on the other, what we discussed as the other costs of podcasting, and what you think that podcasters need to be aware of to kind of keep themselves going, to make this sustainable. Do you want to kind of give us an overview really of what kinds of things you think about in that area? What are the other costs?
Yeah, I think time and energy are perhaps the biggest. There's energy can come in lots of different ways. There's sort of emotional energy and physical energy and all these different things that I think over the pandemic we've perhaps become a little bit more aware of, as we sit on screens and we think about Zoom fatigue and various other things. I think we've perhaps become more aware of how our attention and our time is being used. So one of the things that I find an interesting sort of thing to look at is this idea of spoon theory, which is it's Christina Miserandino, I think, is created this concept, and it's I believe it came from the world of chronic illness and disability, and it's about how we portion out our time and our attention. And so you might say to someone, do you want to go out for a drink tonight? And they might say, I don't have the spoons for that, or I don't have enough spoons. And it's because we think, some people think about measuring their time out in these sort of little portions. And that's useful for us to think about when we come to make podcasts. We might have different spoons for different things at different times. Sometimes we have the spoons for a one-to-one conversation with a guest. Sometimes we have the spoons for editing that conversation and the process involved. Sometimes we have the spoons for marketing and engaging with our listeners and growing the show and email marketing. And so I think what's useful is being aware of what those spoons are, how much you have, and where perhaps if you find that you're running low, who can you reach out to, or how can you reach out for help so that you can keep doing the stuff within podcasting that you love and that energizes you, rather than the stuff that is draining you, because ultimately the more of that draining you have, the less likely you are to get to the next episode.
Mm-hmm. And then finding a way to manage, presumably, if the draining thing is finding an audience and persuading people to come to you, and but you know you need to do that in order to make it sustainable, then that's work, isn't it, to make sure you give yourself the energy, the spoons.
Exactly, it is. And it is different for different people. I was speaking to one of my coaching clients last week, and I said, how do you find the editing process? Because I showed her a particular tool for editing, and so she's been doing that now for a few weeks. And I said, how did you find it? And she said, I love it. And that's not necessarily a common answer for people who, especially, are just starting out in the process. But she really enjoys it. And for me, I enjoy it most of the time. But then there are times where I just think, oh, yeah, today I've got to put this episode out. And yeah, there are lots of other aspects where I used to have a show with, or I still do nominally, with 3 other people, and I loved making it, and I did all of the prep and all of the production and all of that stuff. And then when it came to the episode being published, I had no spoons left to tell the world about it. And as Claire knows, that is so important. It's one thing to make the thing, but it's quite another thing to actually bring it out into the world and let people know and network and meet people and communicate and engage and all these things you need to do to let people know you've got this great podcast. And I had to call on them to say, I need your help with this, because these episodes take a lot to put together, and I kind of need your help to start spreading the word, really.
Yeah. So really, you're reflecting a lot of what Claire said about, being part of a community and sharing and so on. What else are the things that you think will help people to kind of sustain them and keep the process interesting and fun?
I think Claire actually mentioned this as well. I think experimentation is really key, and there are lots of different ways that you can experiment with your podcast, with the way you do the intro, to the music that you use, to the energy that you bring, even little things like if you usually sit when you're recording, what happens if you stand? What happens to your whole physical energy? How does that change how you show up to the mic? There's a show that a friend of mine, she has a podcast about sustainability and food, and she sort of goes back and forth between doing monologue episodes and interviewing people. But for her most recent episode, she decided to just do something different for the fun of it, and put out an episode that was something like 10 lessons I learned about leadership from fostering a puppy. And so she did this as like, here are I can't remember the name of the dog. I think it was Poppy the puppy. Here are the 10 things that Poppy can teach us about leadership. And it was really great. It was a lovely listen, and it just allowed her to kind of be re-energized and to try something new, because the grind, and there are so many podcasters in the chat, and I'm sure that lots of you are aware of, it can be a grind. There is this repetitious process that we go through of planning, pre-production, interviewing, recording, editing, promoting, and then the cycle continues and it's another day and we do it again. And if, like with anything, you know, if you can find ways to keep that spontaneity, keep the energy up, then I think that can really, really help you in the long term.
Yeah. And I suppose one of the measures of success, what we've been talking about it in terms of sort of series, and it's this ability to keep on producing, isn't it? So we talked about, you know, ways you kind of give yourself some energy and enthusiasm, but what impact does that kind of the kind of rolling process have on people, and what can you do about it?
Yeah, it can. So I tend to, I've been threatening to write a book for the last year and a half about the tricky episode 7 and what happens there. There seems to be this kind of moment where we get to about episode 7 for a lot of new podcasters, and because of mismatched or mismanaged expectations, they're not getting the return that they thought that they were going to get. And that's because they've taken a Udemy course for $19.99 that's told them that podcasting is this great growth tool, and it isn't. And so what happens is they get to episode 7 or around there and they go, no one seems to be listening. I know my mum and my friend listen, but like that seems to be it. And then they trail off, and then 2 weeks go by, and then they'll produce an episode, and then we call this pod fade, where it slowly sort of stops. And so part of it is connecting again to what Claire said about figuring out your why. Why are you doing this? Why are you podcasting in the first place? Is it through passion? Is it to, you know, to spread a wider message? And so if you're feeling that pressure, that it feels like no one's listening, that's because right at the beginning, no one is, but you keep going. And so the way to keep going is so one of the pieces of advice that I got from a chap called Drew Ackerman, who hosts a wildly successful podcast called Sleep With Me, where he just lulls people to sleep. His idea was get to episode 20. If I can get to episode 20, then that's great. And that's all I'm going to focus on. And if I don't feel like doing it again after episode 20, then I'll stop. But if I can make it to 20, then great. And he made it to 20. And then he thought, okay, can I make it to 50? And he just set these. And those increments might be quite large for you. You can set much shorter increments. But finding those little stakes in the ground that you can put in to say, at this point, then I can reevaluate. I'm not putting a lot of pressure on myself. I'm not telling myself that I've now got to make this show until I retire. I can think, what happens if I get to episode 5 and then 10 and just focus on that? And then that, I think, can help you not get too sort of swamped in the grind, in the gears.
Thank you. And just my last question to you, really, we've done a lot of talking about kind of getting people to look after their own well-being. And how does what you're saying relate to people who are and we're sort of thinking perhaps about a kind of a podcaster working away independently. How does this relate to people working in arts organisations or in, you know, small or medium-sized organisations?
I think two things. Firstly, it's kind of being aware of people's spoons and what energy they have for you. If you are working in a team where there are multiple people working on the podcast and people have different responsibilities, then it's just about making sure that you are on top of that. But I think the big thing is realizing what the stakes are for different people. So for a funder, the stakes might be that they want to reach a certain audience segment that has been previously disengaged with a particular form of content or a message. There might be a group of people that they want to address, and so that might be how they view the success of the podcast. For a drama piece for the performers. It might be something entirely different. It might be about the emotional impact that the project made. And it's that thing then of, if you can just impact one person, then you've done a great job. And so I think it's just being aware, because there will be multiple stakeholders for a project, especially one that is funded. And it's just being aware of those different stakes, and making sure that you can present information in a way that satisfies that and answers those questions for the people who need to. So if they need to know how many people are listening, rough idea of where they are and that kind of stuff, presenting that information to them, and just trying to, yes, sort of anticipate what their measure of success is, but also keeping an eye on your measure of success as well. And it doesn't your measure of success does not have to be those numbers.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much. So I'm just going to throw it open to the audience now and see if anybody else has any particular questions for you, Mark, and then I'll bring Claire and Rob back in. But let's just give it a minute and see if there's anything from the audience. What is there anything else that you haven't had a chance to say yet that you think you'd like to throw into the mix, Mark?
That's a good question. I'm not sure my ADD-addled brain will allow me to pull anything out. But I'm sure I'll think of something as soon as we've finished.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Then let's see. So there's lots of good commentary coming in. Let's go back to the question then about audience building. And it's not for everybody, and perhaps everybody who's in the chat, people in the chat will have built an audience from nothing. But what's your answer to that? What are the first steps or specific useful bits of information about building an audience?
I got given a great piece of advice from someone last year, which is, so it was about how I can communicate to someone that I have something that they would want to listen to. And his metaphor was, imagine you're in a crowded tube platform, and you throw a ball, and you just sort of throw it out and say, somebody catch this. The likelihood of someone catching that ball is pretty low. Whereas if I say, Linda, catch this ball, or Claire, catch this ball, the likelihood then is they'll turn around and catch the ball, and then they can throw it to someone else. They can say, Rob, catch this ball. And so what that says to me is, when we are looking at building an audience from scratch, it's a little bit like that metaphor of eating the elephant. You've just got to start one person at a time and make the stuff, because if you're making something for a defined audience, you will hopefully know who some of those people are. And it is then just saying, I made this thing for you. You can invite them into a WhatsApp group before you publish to say, I'm working on a podcast. I'd love you to hear it. I can drop the audio into the WhatsApp group for you. You can check it out. Let me know what you think. And start to build that little team. I call it a street team of people who can help sort of spread the word and be interested and give you feedback at that early stage.
Yeah, lovely. Let's bring the other two in and see if either of them have anything to add to that. Specific bits of advice for audience building. Rob, I can see you.
Hey everybody. Yeah, and I was going to sort of pick up on a question that Catherine's just asked, because this is quite a sort of common challenge that we see. Quite often, particularly within the arts, you might have an organisation that is funded on a project by project basis. And it might be that the work they're doing is very different. It might be they've got a podcast about their work, promoting their work, but the nature of that core work, what it is, seems to change quite a lot. So it almost feels like you're sort of telling a new story, doing things in seasons as well, and kind of building up that audience. Catherine, thank you. And I just said, do you publish each run as a new series of a core podcast, or do you start from scratch each time with a new freshly branded podcast? And you seem to be doing the right thing, which is to keep it under that same central umbrella. So if you've attracted me in based on a project that you did a year ago, I started subscribing then, I'm still going to start hearing the new podcasts that you're doing at the moment. And I sort of wanted to open it up to Mark and Claire as well. It does feel like there's space within podcasting for us to tell for us to have almost story arcs and then start telling different stories, as long as they appeal to that same demographic, as long as we're not veering wildly off into new territory. Am I right in saying that? I might not be. Am I right in saying that there's space for that? Or is there any advice around that idea of starting a different narrative?
I think that's really interesting. And as someone who's worked as a mentor, as part of, the mentoring program, which is open now, for the next week or so, it's very interesting because I'll give an example of someone who I supported 2 years ago, New Perspectives Theatre in Nottingham. And they did a project called Place Prints. They worked with the writer David Rudkins. They had a collection of these stories, which were kind of about real places across the UK. And they were fascinating little stories. They were true stories, almost quite horror, really. But they didn't have a home. They didn't work as monologues on stage. And so they decided, with a bit of support from me and Rob, to say, you should really think about a podcast. We decided to go into podcast world, but it wasn't like we were creating a New Perspectives podcast series and each season was like a different project. For them, they looked at each kind of project was completely separate. So it's a completely separate strand. So in a way, yes, I think what Catherine's touching on is you are starting a new audience really kind of from scratch each season. You're not kind of building on followers, where I think seasons savvy kind of podcast stuff is where you can kind of have things under a clear umbrella, like the National Football Museum. We've worked and supported them. They're doing their second series at the moment, and they've decided to kind of serialize it. So their series 1 was about football shirts. It tied in with an exhibition they had. Now their next series is a bit more community based. They're touching more on women's football, coming up to the UEFA women's tournament, which is in July. So it has a peg. And they're building on, so the followers they built in series 1 will then also come across automatically to series 2, and they can build on that audience. I think, but if you are really thinking about, don't worry too much if you're kind of starting again and separating it in its different strands, because it's different. They're kind of slightly different audiences, and sometimes if you kind of constrict yourself into, well, this is our umbrella and we need to kind of keep to that audience each time, it's sometimes different projects aim at different people, different audiences. So you don't worry too much if you are separating it out and you're not kind of having that follow on. It is possible to do either. You've just got to look at your project, your story, the audience you're reaching, and decide, can we continue that, or is it best for us to kind of go with a different outlook this time? And the space and the mentoring program can help you do either of those.
Lovely, thank you.
Do you mind if I just add as well, because there was an extra point that Catherine did say as well, saying that you use a speaker to manage the separate shows under one umbrella. So there is that consistency of, I'm assuming you mean the presenter, the voice there. If I'm listening to the podcast, I'm hearing that same voice at the start of each one, bringing me into the story as well. And I think that's hugely important. I think there is an aspect of podcasting whereby it is almost a sort of relationship with that person, if that makes sense. I don't think that's overstating it to say you're sort of enjoying that, spending time with that person's voice, with that person's energy, with that person's kind of opinions and storytelling skills and things like that as well. So I think that's a great thing to recognise and for you to be doing, Catherine. Yeah.
Great, thank you. We've had another question. I don't know if anybody has an opinion on this, asking about Vimeo and Twitch, and then they're speaking about somebody suggesting you might try that for podcasting. Any thoughts?
I think Twitch is mad. Like Twitch.tv. I mean, it's more about video gaming, if I'm right, Mark, really, isn't it? But there is a category in there, and I put it on my spreadsheet. There's a link to the category into Twitch.tv, which is a category where you basically just watching people podcasting, and then people can kind of chip in and donate if they like the content, and it's very fluid. And that's where people like Ian Lee and Catherine Boyle are really having success. And I watched one the other day, and it was literally like they got a pizza delivered in the middle of it, and you kind of watched them disappear, and you could hear them answering the door. And then Ian realized that he hadn't tipped the driver, and it was the same driver that he forgot to tip last time. And it's like, people were paying for this. I was like, mad. So to be honest, I think, Melissa, you know, don't rule it out. I mean, Twitter Spaces, I don't know how many of you really engaged in Twitter Spaces. It's like kind of the clubhouse for Twitter, isn't it, really? And anybody can start a Twitter space, and, you know, you become a speaker about your passion, your subject, and it starts on that. I watched, you know, the Liverpool Man U game the other night, and afterwards went on Twitter and listened to, you know, people in Africa talking about the game, people in Ireland talking about the game, and they were all in their different Twitter spaces connecting. And I think that is exciting. So Melissa, just play with it. Just find, you know, some of it you might not necessarily be able to get funding to kind of go and do this. Some of it you just might need to try, you know, on a spare evening if you have some spoons left.
Lovely. There's a couple of ideas in the chat as well for how to find out more. And Joe's asking, any ideas on a platform which lets you pay to subscribe, which includes audio content such as Substack? So is that like anything other than Substack?
Patreon's very good at the moment. There's a couple of people that
yeah.
and I know someone, I think the Empire Magazine Spoiler Special podcast, which is a couple of quid a month, and they've got that set up to use different ones. I think that's a paid option on Google as well. There's a few of those platforms will let you go on as a sort of premiere one. But yeah.
Supercast is a platform that manages I think it might be supercast.co, and they manage the onboarding and the process of how you can get subscribers on a paid feed. They work with Spotify. They're one of the very few that let Spotify users subscribe to private paid podcasts. So that might be worth looking into, because the problem with the Substack idea is nice. The part of the issue there is they want you to use their app with the podcast stuff, and I think you need to try and I think anyway you should meet listeners where they are, and so if you are getting a lot of listeners in Spotify, then running something like Supercast where that you can they can still access your show, your paid content through Spotify, I think is and through all other apps as well.
That's a good shout. I put that on my my presentation as well. Yeah, I put it there because Acast Plus is another big player. People hear about Acast a lot. It's one of the podcast hosts. They've got Acast Plus, but you've got to use the Acast app to go and listen to the paid subscription content. Whereas you're right, people have got Apple Podcasts in their car, they've got Spotify on their phone. That's where they listen to their podcasts. Don't make me go somewhere else.
No, and that's where I'm like, the idea of the paid subscriptions in Apple is, sure, that's great, but like not everyone has an iPhone, and most people don't have iPhones. And while the majority of podcast listening at the moment is still kind of in the Apple space, that will change. Especially as more people discover what's out there, and Spotify's done a huge amount to do that already, and so I think locking it down to one platform, I think then makes life harder for yourself when you want to build an audience.
I'm going to stop there and ask everybody, if you wouldn't mind, what we do at this point is give you a link to our evaluation form, which only takes a minute or two. It's very quick to fill in, but it really, really helps us to understand what's going on, what you've liked, what we should be doing more of. So we'd really, really appreciate that. And while you're doing that, I'm going to say to the panelists, when we come back, we'll just have time for final thoughts from you. And one thing that I thought we could perhaps I could ask you about specifically is networks and support. You know, because as Mark says, podcasting can be quite a lonely place. And who you've already talked about the communities you're part of, but just ideas for a network or support that would help people to sort of develop and help to make their podcast sustainable. But we'll come back to that. So 2 minutes to fill in the evaluation, and then we'll come back for that final wrap up.
Thank you, everyone.
Right. Okay, so I'll get the speakers back just for those final thoughts. And Claire will be with us in a second, I'm sure. Here she is.
Too busy chatting.
Great, thank you. And thank you everybody for all the contributions all the way through. It's been fantastic and really interesting, and there's lots of support, isn't there, and will to work together and share ideas and ways of doing things. It's excellent. So just on that note, really, final thoughts from the three of you. Mark, what would you say about it? Do you have a kind of top tip or a bit of advice for getting help and support?
I will go with a very quick, practical, simple one, and it is to follow someone. I will post the name in the chat because it's not the easiest, but follow on Twitter Ariel Nissenblatt. She is a maverick maven connector of all things when it comes to podcasting and people. She's incredibly enthusiastic, has lots of time or makes lots of time to do this stuff on Twitter. I will post her details shortly, but she's a really great nexus of information and resource, and yeah, she makes a lot of time for people.
Fabulous, thank you. And Claire, do you have a suggestion or a recommendation?
I mean, I've already mentioned Mixed Podcast Club, which is free, a meetup online once a month. Podnews.net is great. It's a daily newsletter that's emailed to you with a sum up of what's happening around the world, really. They've got like over 20,000 subscribers to their newsletter. They also do a podcast if you prefer to listen to it in a spoken form instead of a written form. And yeah, whenever I need to go and research something, I go there because they also put links. They kind of, it's like the Google search. They're just on top of everything that's happening everywhere, and it's a nice place to come back to when you have a cup of tea, you know, for a 5-minute break, just to kind of see what's happening. And I find new series there to listen to. And yeah, this tip about, like, you know, watching YouTube and where that's going with podcasting at the moment is really interesting. And actually it was there on Pod News that I found out that they had leaked the kind of the imagery behind what they're setting up in the dashboard for YouTube to make it more podcasters friendly. So great place to be on the nose and seeing what events and things like that are happening.
Brilliant. Okay. Kristen, Mark put the link into the Pod News, so that's in the chat. Rob, just a final word for you, and we've literally got 1 minute left.
Yeah, I'll keep this really, really quick then. I would give an extra plug to the Spaces Mentoring Programme for those of you who are in England, as this one is funded by ACE. Do have a look at that. Applications are open for the next week, and it is a very short application form. Just let us know what you're interested in exploring. And yeah, we'll be assessing those after that as well. So yeah, do have a look at that. And the other thing I would say is, yeah, podcasting is a community. So just sort of be aware of one another. I mean, I would say, you know, I would love to see any of you guesting on each other's podcasts as a result of today as well. I think it's a really healthy thing to do, and it benefits everyone. So yeah, don't be afraid to reach out to one another.
Brilliant. So just finally to say, as I said already, thank you audience for all your contributions, questions and ideas. It's great. And a massive thank you to our speakers for sharing their insight and their research and their knowledge and their recommendations so generously. It's hugely appreciated. Thank you, everybody, and see you again soon. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.